Please welcome our next superhero, Dan Edwards. Today, he will present his session on using Power Apps, Teams, and Dynamics 365 F&O Finance. Please stick around after Dan's session for a live Q&A.
All right, let's get started today looking at using Power Apps, Teams, and Dynamics 365 Finance. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dan Edwards. I'm a CPA and Managing Director at Crow. We're a large CPA firm here in the United States. I bring about 30 years or more, I've kind of stopped counting at this point, of implementing and supporting technology solutions, been working with Dynamics and Microsoft for many years, specializing in both reporting, BI tools, and especially the Power Platform. I'd really like to thank DynamicsCon for this opportunity to present. Had the chance on a couple of their other events and just love working with that organization. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation that we're doing today and look at the objectives. So as I mentioned, we're talking about teams, and I don't know about you, but the one thing that I'm working with all the time is Microsoft Teams. And I've got it running on my computer from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, right there with Outlook. And if I could just tie more of what I do in D365 finance and supply chain into Teams, it would make it a lot easier for me. So working with a lot of our clients, we've seen that same need. So that's what I'm going to address, is how we've tackled some of that. So our agenda today, we're going to start with some of the key setup pieces that we need to keep in mind. Then we're going to look at how we can actually embed pieces of D365 Finance directly into Teams. We'll use Microsoft Teams for approvals. We'll use Teams to get information out to our team in our AR team or AP team, things like that. Then we'll look more at Power Apps and how we can work with Canvas apps in Teams and model-driven apps in Teams that are also tied back to D365 Finance. So as I go through these, if you guys have any questions, I'm monitoring the chat window. So feel free to enter your questions in the chat. I'll respond back to those or come on later at the end with some responses to those questions. So with that, let's jump into those key setups. So the first thing you need to understand, especially when working with Teams or any of the Power Platform, is how does D365 Finance and Supply Chain work with the Dataverse? So I know there's other sessions during this conference talking specifically about things like dual write. So you'll want to make sure to attend those sessions so you get an understanding of where dual write comes in and how it keeps the two databases synchronized, bi-directional, does change tracking, things like that. But then there's also the option to use virtual entities. So I believe there's some sessions around those as well. That's nice because it's not actually moving the data, it's keeping the data in one source. So you're going to see me use probably both of those in some of my examples, but really need to make sure you have that understanding as you move forward in working with the Power Platform and D365. The other tool you're going to see me use a lot is Power Automate. So Power Automate's one of the key components of the Power Platform. It's really a low-code tool to help you automate and do both approvals as well as move data between applications. So keeping things synchronized between Power Apps and D365 Finance or Teams or SharePoint. So this is really going to be the key to trigger a lot of the events that you'll see happening in my application. So that's another tool that you're going to want to make sure you have a good understanding as you're bringing these together. So with those key setups out of the way, let's start with a real simple one. How can we embed D365 Finance and Supply Chain into Teams? What do I mean by that? Well, the easiest way to look at that is here in a scenario. So in my scenario, we have a credit team. They manage all the collection process with our clients, and they work very closely together inside of Microsoft Teams. So, they're able to do their chats, hold their meetings, but they also can gather and store information in there. So it'd be really nice if they had access to all the collection components of D365 directly from Teams as well. So, what that might look like is taking that customer credit and collection workspace and embedding that right inside Microsoft Teams. Very simple, actually, to do. Not sure many people are aware of this, but you can embed a website directly inside of Teams. And that's what D365 is. It's a website. And there's actually a little component there that you can add to the end of the URL that I'm calling out here in the screenshot. And it's that ampersand sign, limited nav equals true. So you need to find the window that you want in D365 and embed that in Teams. So probably the easiest way to do that is let's take a look at a demo of that. So I'm just going to jump over here to D365, and I'm going to go ahead and open up my customer credit and collection workspace. So we'll give that just a second. That comes up, and this is the screen that I would love to see in Teams instead of my browser. So I'm going to just simply go ahead and highlight that URL, and then I'm going to come out here and switch out into Teams. Let's go ahead and make this full screen. I've got a team over here for credit management, and I'm going to simply come up here and add a tab into this team. And you can see there's many different tab types that I can install. So I'm going to just simply add that website that we were talking about there, and I'm going to call that collections, and I'm going to paste that URL, and then at the end of that, simply type in that limited nav equals true. And what you're doing there is taking away the navigational functions, seeing all the modules on the left-hand side, those components of D365. So now the first time I do this, I need to log in. So this isn't a way to get around licensing. These still need to be users in D365, but now they have access to that directly from Teams. So I'm not opening a new browser. What's nice is all of these tiles here all work. So if I want to go see my customers over credit limits, I can simply click on that and I can see my customers over credit limits. I can click the X and simply drop back to the original workspace. So again, now that's just added as a tab there in their credit management team. So very easy for us to bring that together. So that's the first piece. So let's move on to our second component. So this is using Teams to keep up with our workflows and approvals inside of D365. So an example here is we do purchase order approvals. So we're using the standard D365 workflow to do those purchase order approvals. But it would be really nice, the person that's approving those doesn't necessarily sit in D365 all the time, so they're not getting the alerts, they're not seeing it in their work items. They want to see it in Teams when that comes up. Microsoft made this one real easy because it's actually a template that is part of Power Automate. So you can use this out-of-the-box template to just simply fill in what your URL, what your connection to D365 is for your instance, and it's going to push that through the process. So this is kind of a screenshot. So these slides will be available for you so you can kind of see what's going on in here. But you'll just simply have to update that template with which workflow you want to use and which instance of D365 you're working with. This whole coding section here in the middle, the JSON, that comes out of the template. So you don't have to worry about knowing how to write JSON. And then you simply, again, enter your instance of D365 at the bottom. And what's going to happen is this approval is going to appear inside of Teams as part of the approval. So you'll get an activity alert inside of Teams. So again, let's jump back into D365. So we'll get out of Teams here for a minute. I'm going to jump back to my homepage in D365, and I have a purchase order here. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this purchase order, and I'm going to simply submit this to workflow. And as we all know, the workflow engine takes a moment to process. So I'm going to let that process. And while that processes, after I enter a comment here, please approve this purchase today. So that way we can see this is actually going to be running live. So I'll go ahead and submit that. I'm going to switch over to another tab here and just take a look real quickly at the workflow that is running. So I've got a workflow here running. I'm going to go ahead and edit this. And again, this came from the template. So you'll see here I've entered my instance of D365. I've entered my business event, and then it's bringing in these components. So again, this was started, and I can go ahead and check now to see if it's running. It's still not running. So we'll go ahead and step back. But if I say I want to build a new flow from a template, I can just simply go in here and type in Dynamics 365, and you can see it comes up right here as one of the templates. So this is the template that I started with. You make your connection based on your user, and you're able to go ahead and complete that. So again, we'll come back to that flow here real quickly, and we'll see that that flow is now running. So again, in Power Automate, you can keep an eye on those flows and see that they are running for you. So if we jump out here to Teams, I'm going to jump back up to my activity, and it's going to take it a second to pop over. But what you'll see is you'll get an action needed. And there you go. While we were looking at that one, it just popped up. So you can see we're running a live demo here, and it says to please approve this purchase today. What I really like about this is I can click on that attachment, and it takes that user right into D365. So even if they weren't logged in, they can come right back in and take a look at this purchase order, where they can then approve it here, or they could also do the approval right here inside of Teams. So they could approve it. They can also follow up, cancel it, reassign it, do all the same activities they could do inside of D365. So again, tying Teams right into the process there. So let's go ahead, keep on moving through here. I've got quite a few scenarios I want to show you. If you've got questions on these while I'm going through, again, please put these in the chat and I'll respond back to you and hopefully be able to give you some answers or directions on how you could use this in your organization. This is another one I really like, is getting that information out. So, there's a lot of inquiries and reports inside of D365, but sometimes it's nice to just push information out to the teams. So going back to that credit team we talked about with the collection workspace, they also are responsible for reviewing customers' credit limits. So it would be nice to kind of send them a task list on a regular basis. So every week, here's the customers that need to have their credit reviewed. So that's kind of the scenario I've set up here. The first thing you need to do to set this scenario up is make sure you have the right data inside of D365. So again, I'm looking at the credit review information. So you can see there's a field in D365 to track that. The next scheduled review is entered on the customer card right here. So I can go ahead and enter that date. And then I'm going to use Power Automate. Power Automate can run on a scheduled basis as well as an automatic basis. So I'm going to simply trigger this Power Automate to run once a week. So have it run on the Monday of every week. And then I have it list out information it finds in a table. So what you'll see here is I'm using the connector from Power Automate to D365 and using the entity customers V3. I could also use the connector to the Dataverse if I'm using those virtual entities that I talked about earlier. So you've got a little bit of flexibility on how you could make that connection. The real driving factor on this one is the query. So I'm actually looking, I need to understand what is the field name there. So the next scheduled review date, if it's greater than now, and if it is less than, so GT is greater than, LT is less than, and then add days is 7 days from now. So I'm going to look at all of the information in that table where that credit review date is in the next week. And then I can send that information back to my users inside of Teams. So that's where this is kind of a second screenshot. So if it comes back with no records, I want to just cancel this Power Automate. If you don't do that, you actually get an error message that the Power Automate failed. So that's why I've put a condition in here to send it to no. So you'll learn some of that as you're starting to learn Power Automate. But then I kind of organize the fields here in an HTML table, and then I post this information back to the Teams channel. And they get a report like this popping up in Teams every Monday morning. So again, let's jump back over here and take a look at what that might look like. So we don't need to be in Teams right now. Let's actually go over here to Power Automate. We're going to jump back to our flows. And I've got, as you can see on my screen, I have several flows running. Some of them are kind of grayed out because they're turned off. They were part of testing. But all the ones that are bright are actually running active in my system right now. So I'm going to come into this one and edit so you can kind of see how this one was built. So as I mentioned, there's a reoccurrence, run it once on a daily basis. So again, I can set up different options on how often this runs. So it could be once every day, once every week, every month. You can run this every hour if you were really trying to get a lot of data out there. You got to keep in mind how many flows you run, things like that are impacting your licensing and costs. So just keep that information in mind as you're building these out. So then when it runs, what do I want it to do? Well, I want it to list items present in the table. So I'm just going to click on plus so you can see how that action gets added. So again, if you come out here and do Dynamics 365, you'll see the connector here is the Fin and Ops connector, D365, and you'll see the different things you can do. So you can create records, you can delete records. We'll talk about those in a few moments, but I can also list the items that are present in the tables, and that's what I'm going to do in this case. So I don't need to add that step again, so I'll just cancel that. But you'll see what it asks for is what instance of D365. So you may have production, you may have sandbox, things like that. Choose the appropriate one. And I'm just getting alerted to approve that PO again, but we'll let that go away. And then I have the entities or the different ways you can get data from D365. So you need to understand your data entities. In this case, I'm doing customer V3. And then I'm setting up a variable to do some of this formatting here on the left-hand side. But what it finally finishes with is a list of the output for the next 7 days. So probably the easiest way to see this is to go ahead and kick it off. So I can manually generate this versus waiting for the scheduled time. So it's going to go ahead and run. We'll check that. So it's running through the process. It should only take about 10, 15 seconds here to run through. We'll refresh that here a couple times, give it another second or so. It's moving through. If it gets any errors, you're going to see that here. So if I did anything wrong, but at that point, it is complete. So if we jump into Teams, I can see right there, I've got some activity that's letting me know that that status was complete, but I want to jump into Teams. And I want to just come over here to my post. And sure enough, there it is. I tested this a little while back. So there was another one in here, but this is 5:32 p.m. That's my time right now. So I can see here are the 4 customers that have a next review date. So from there, they can follow through as they need to with the collection team. So this is just one example. This could be sent out, credit customers that are due to pay. This could be AP invoices that are due. So kind of let your mind wander of what you could gather. If you can query the data in D365, you could use Power Automate to push that over to Teams. So again, let's move forward to next couple of sections we have here. So now that we've sent a bunch of data over, we've done a lot of work with Power Automate. Our last 2 sections here, we're going to look at bringing in more of Power Apps and working with Power Apps, Teams, and D365. So we're going to start with a Canvas app. So what is a Canvas app? So there's 2 different ways you can build apps in Power Apps. And I know there's some sessions along building those apps. So I'm not going to get real deep into how these apps are all built, but talk more about how they're tied to D365. But a Canvas app is simply a drag and drop onto a blank canvas. So you've got a lot of flexibility in what you can make this look like. You can put it on a tablet or a mobile device. It can connect to many different data sources. So connect to Dataverse, connect to SharePoint, connect to D365. So in my scenario, and I run into this one quite often with our clients, they want to have an onboarding process for new vendors. So they don't want to simply go right into D365 and create a new vendor. They need to have a vendor request form that needs to go through an approval process. They need to make sure they've got all the key information before they ever create that vendor in D365. So it's kind of an outside D365 process, but at the end, they want all that data to be transferred in. They don't want to have to rekey everything. So that's what this scenario is going to look like. And to attack that, I did really just a simple Canvas app. Now, this could have been done a lot more complex, could have a lot more information on it. But you can see there in the screenshot, I just really put in the key information required for creating a new vendor. So I've got the vendor name, the address information, their email information, and what group they're in. Now, the key with this, again, I'm not putting this data straight into D365. So this isn't just another input mechanism to do the new vendor. It's going to go through an approval process. So in this case, I've actually based it on a SharePoint list. So I actually created in our company SharePoint a list that has these same columns. And when this Canvas app saves the data, it saves it to SharePoint. Now, after that data is saved to SharePoint, we're going to go to the next screen. I'm going to move my slides forward here. There we go. And now I need a Power Automate to say, what do I do after Power Apps saves the record to SharePoint? So you'll notice on this screenshot that I'm saving it to SharePoint. When an item is created in SharePoint, start a process. So that's what's going to be the automation or the kickoff point of this Power Automate is when an item is saved to SharePoint. Then it goes through an approval process. And again, this is where I can bring Teams into the equation. So it goes through that approval process. I'm going to get an alert in Teams because that's kind of embedded with Power Automate. And then when that new vendor is approved and added, it can post a message back to Teams saying, hey, we have a new vendor. When it's not approved, it could post a message back saying your submission was not approved. And then it can update the SharePoint item to being entered into the system, or it could delete it from SharePoint. Just really depends on the process you want to go. So that's what's really nice about Power Automate. You've got flexibility to build how you want this process to work. And the key is to remember you can be adding information into D365 this way. So this is what it's going to look like when it moves to the approval process. Once that approval takes place, it goes into D365. Now, to make this straightforward for my users, I actually use a number sequence to assign the vendor number. So that way they're not having to assign a vendor number in the process. D365 will take the next available number. Since it assigns that next number, we then want to send that next number out to the users when we create that new vendor. So you can see here when I post the chat back, I let the user know, hey, the vendor added was US-301. And I can also send them an email to share that information. Finally, you can continue using Power Automate. So I broke it off as a second Power Automate flow, but I then send a welcome letter or welcome email to the vendor. And I even attach the W-9 form that I need them to complete and return to us to finish their setup. So again, giving us a full process from the purchase department saying, hey, we need a new vendor, to the actual vendor being entered into the system and receiving a welcome email with a request for a W-9 form, all by using Power Automate to do that. So let's jump in and see how that looks. I'm going to start with SharePoint. And SharePoint here, I've just created a SharePoint list that has all the different columns that are available. So that's what I'm using as the basis for this Power App. So if I come in here to Power Apps, I have a Power App here called New Vendor. Just going to go ahead and edit that. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how this was created. You can actually have Power Apps automatically create a form for you based on that SharePoint side as well. There's some automation there. But I wanted to make mine very simple. So I've created this here on my Save button. I have it submitting this form back to that SharePoint site. So then I'm going to embed this form inside of Teams for my users to work with. So if we jump out to Teams, come back over here, I've got that running somewhere on my computer here, a few things running. I'm going to come back out here, and you'll notice right up here at the top, I have a new vendor tab. So I've already embedded this, but to embed those, very simple. As we saw earlier, I just simply click on the plus sign, and I can come out here and search for Power Apps. And when I click on Power Apps, it's going to give me a list of my apps. I can also look at other apps in the organization. So I just simply selected that new vendor in this case and was able to add that into the system. So now I can simply enter a new vendor, DynamicsCon, and 123 Main. I'm here in Huntington Beach, so I'll give it that address. Give it a phone number. And I'm going to put my email address, if I can type it right here, so we can see how all that works. And then I'm going to select a vendor group and save it. So that's all that has to be done inside of Teams. So now if we jump back over here to managing our flows, I can come over here and look at my new vendor flow that we have set up in the system. I'm going to go ahead and open that. And this is where, if we'll put that in edit mode, you'll see where I'm connected to that SharePoint site. I'm waiting for that approval to go through. And what's nice with Flow is you can actually bring in all those different fields that were just entered. So we're going to see that on the approval. And then finally, if that is approved, we'll end up adding this back in. And there I just got a message that it's ready to be approved. I'm going to add that back into the vendor group using the virtual entity. And the key here is here's all the fields. So you just have to come in here and map. You see how I map city and keep scrolling down. I map the title, map the email address, the phone number, all of that information gets mapped in under that connection. So if we go ahead and leave this flow, we'll see it's running. When I jump back in here to Teams, and since I'm set up as the approver, I got this message. And again, you have control of who that approver would be. If that needed to be the AP manager or something like that. But again, see all this information right here. They even have an attachment to go back into SharePoint, and then they can simply approve or reject. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this vendor. And while that gets approved, there's the message that comes back saying that this vendor has been approved. So that's kind of your approval history. And now the flow is continuing to run, and it's letting me know now that I just got a chat back. So this chat just came in today. Your vendor request for DynamicsCon has been approved and created in D365 with the number US 350. So if we come back out here to D365 and I look at vendors, got a few alerts going off there. I scroll down here and I think I just saw it. There it is. DynamicsCon US 350 got added into the system. That's the email address we put in, or the address that we put in, my email address and phone number. All that information came in automatically into the system. So now if I look real quick, I do have my email running. So I can see those approvals are coming in through email as well. So I can see all of that information. So you can control, do I want it in email? Do I want it in Teams? So you've got control over how all this moves through. So again, you can see how easily we can integrate all those together. Data appeared inside of D365 when we did no actual activity inside of D365. So let's go ahead, now that we've seen how we could work with a Canvas app, let's go ahead and move forward to our last topic, using model-driven apps. And model-driven apps are a little different than a Canvas app. They're all still built in Power Apps, but they are more of a design solution, right? For those that are familiar with D365 sales, D365 marketing, those are all model-driven apps. Project Operations has a model-driven app. So those work with storing most of their data, if not all of their data, in the Dataverse. So they can work with Power Automate, Power BI, things like that. Now, model-driven apps is something Microsoft is doing a lot with now. They actually have a new model-driven app that's going to be the invoice capture component. So I think there's some other sessions on that, or there's information coming from Microsoft on this new invoice capture. But while it works with AP and is fully integrated with the AP, it kind of stands alone in this model-driven app. So now my AP clerk would have to open up two different tabs to be able to access that information. Well, that's where, again, embedding things in Teams can come in very handy. So what I can do to embed a model-driven app, kind of just like we saw a few moments ago with the Canvas-driven app, is I can click on the Power Apps inside of Teams. And the key there is searching for model-driven apps. So then I can look for my model-driven apps, in this case, find that invoice capture, and then I can embed that inside of the team for people to work with. Now, you can also create your own model-driven app. So if you have something kind of structured process that you wanted to create, that could be built out in a model-driven app. Again, it's a low-code solution. So it's really creating some Dataverse tables and bringing those into the model-driven format to allow you to do that. So again, I was approached by a client. They didn't want to use expense entry. They were really trying to limit how many people were putting things into D365. They wanted just a simple way for people to request checks. and to submit a check request. They wanted to just kind of drop those in as invoices inside of payables. Maybe not the perfect scenario I would do it, but that's what this client wanted to do. So we actually ended up building a model-driven app to do that, handle all the approval process through Power Automate, and then submit the approved portion back into D365. So I'm not going to really talk again about how this was all built out because we really don't have enough time to get into that. But what you'll see here is the model-driven app can tie directly to D365. So I'm able to see the list of vendors. So you can use a query of the vendors inside of the model-driven app. I can choose the account numbers, my financial dimensions, a business unit, department, and then again, have an approval process where I'm using Power Automate. Once that process goes through, I can get an email or a Teams alert about approving it. And then once that's approved, it's going to update that app. And then based on how I have that app and approval flow set up, it will then send that information back directly into Teams or into D365, into D365, setting it up ready for payment. So kind of behind the scenes, the big key with the model-driven app, my Canvas app, I use SharePoint to store all my data. My model-driven app is going to work with Dataverse tables. So instead of creating a SharePoint list for check requests, I created a Dataverse table for check requests. And what's nice in that Dataverse table is you can create lookup columns. So that's kind of what I'm showing over here on the right-hand side, and have it look up data from those virtual entities in D365. So I can have it look up the list of account numbers. I can have it look up the vendor list, things like that, and tie those two tables together. Then I use Power Automate when a record is created in that check request table that we just created, start my process. So that's how the approval goes through. So I'm not going to get into really how to build all of this, but I do want to just kind of show you what it looks like. So if I jump over here to Power Apps, again, I can edit this, and what you'll see here is the different layout for a model-driven app. So again, it's driven really off this check request table. So probably the best way to show you that is to go back into the data and actually look at that table. So let's just step back here, and I'm going to go into the Dataverse into tables. And what's nice, again, new table. So you can create all the tables you want here. So I'm going to go ahead and say all and find my check request table. So there's my check request table, and I'm going to go ahead and open that. And if I go ahead and put this in edit mode, you can kind of see the type of information that's being added. And so I've got the request reason, the check reason, and there's numerous additional columns that I've added. So that's where I've added the account number, so I can see the account number comes in. And again, that's from looking up the list. So that's how it was created behind the scenes. Again, there could be a whole session on just building out model-driven apps. But what I want to talk about is connecting those. We'll kind of finish up with connecting that back into Teams. So if I come here into credit management, or actually that should be in AP, go into the AP team, and you'll see here I have the check request. So it was simply added here. What I don't have, since I've already added this one, I'm going to go ahead and add that invoice capture one I just talked about. So again, click on that plus sign, click on Power Apps. Now this one, the invoice capture, these model-driven apps, they're not my apps, so I don't find them that way. They're model-driven apps. So here I can see all the model-driven apps that we have installed in our environment have a few of them, so it takes it a moment to come up. I want to add that invoice capture. Just simply select that. This is the same way I added, if I scroll up, this is the same way I added the check request. So I don't want to post about this in the team, so I'll uncheck that. I'll add that invoice capture, and now that displays right inside of Teams. So now my AP team is going to be able to see all the invoices that are getting captured in OCR in here. So again, any model-driven app. So invoice capture is one that comes from Microsoft. Check request is one that I built for a client request. So that's simply how you can connect a model-driven app to Teams as well as D365. So with that, I think we've covered quite a bit of information. Just in summary, and again, as I'm going through this, feel free to post any of your questions that you might have about what I've shown today in the chat. I'd love to answer those. Be coming online here in just a few moments to answer some of those live. But just want to wrap this up with letting you know, these were just some examples, right? There's many different options of how you can tie Teams and D365 Finance together. Look at your business processes, determine, where people maybe doing a lot of things manually, entering data twice, things like that. That may be places where you could bring Teams, Power Platform, and D365 together. And be sure to test all this. I'm sure you guys are all veterans at all of that, but do all this in a sandbox first. Test it all before you roll it out to production, especially integration, security, things like that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and look at what's in the chat, but I want to thank everybody for attending this session. Here's my contact information. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Feel free to go out to my blog there on danscorner.info. Post a lot of information and some directions about how to build a lot of what you've seen today. So again, thank you, DynamicsCon, for giving me the opportunity to present this session. Thank you all for attending. Hope to see you guys at a live event, hopefully DynamicsCon Live coming up soon. And let me go take a look at those questions. And again, thanks so much for everything you guys are doing here at DynamicsCon for the community. And thanks everyone for attending.